Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is the Panasonic Lumix GH6, the latest model in the hugely popular series aimed at hybrid shooters and demanding videographers. Panasonic loaned me a pre-production model to test, and in this first looks review I'm going to show you everything I've learned about it so far. I'm going to concentrate on the video capabilities here with a brief look at photo quality, then I'm going to follow up later with anything that I've missed, so do let me know in the comments what else you'd like to see me do, and make sure you're subscribed if you don't want to miss it. Teased in May 2021 and officially launched in February 2022, the GH6 cost $21.99 or £2,000 for the body alone. Like its predecessors, it's a mirrorless camera based on the Micro Four Thirds standard, with headline features including 4K 120p, 5.7K ProRes internal, unlimited recording with active cooling, and a brand new 25.2 megapixel sensor with built-in stabilization that's good for 7.5 stops. Yep, that's right, the GH6 may have been announced just 1 week after the Olympus OM1, but I can now confirm that both Micro Four Thirds flagship cameras are using new and different sensors, each with their pros and cons. And while the GH6 still doesn't employ phase detect autofocus, the video quality is excellent, even beating some full-frame rivals costing almost twice as much, while packing in a feature set that will delight pro videographers. Right, let's get on with it. In the 5 years since the original GH5, the new GH6 has beefed up, chunkier all round, 823 grams with battery, roughly 100 grams heavier too. Much of the additional heft over the GH5 is the addition of an active cooling system, with a heatsink, fan and vents pushing the screen mechanism outwards. I'll talk more about this later on in the video, but in my tests so far it's allowed unlimited recording without any overheating. Panasonic describes the GH6 as splash, dust and freeze-proof, even with those vents, although like most camera companies, falls short of quoting an official rating. Olympus remains the exception in this regard, quoting their latest OM1 as being IP53 rated, and in case you were wondering, the Olympus is comfortably lighter too at 599 grams including battery. The GH6 shutter is rated to 200K actuations and the OM1 to 400K. The GH6 grip is decent sized with an indented inner area for your fingertips and a tactile coating ensuring a comfortable and secure hold. At first glance the controls look similar to the GH5, but there's been some tweaks here and there. The non-lockable drive dial remains on the upper left side of the body, now offering direct access to the self timer, interval timer, high-res shot mode, 2 burst modes and single shooting, but there's no longer any 4K or 6K photo options here or within the menus. I'm not sure where or why they've gone. On the upper right side there's still a satisfyingly chunky mode dial with a ballpoint pen style locking mechanism, and while the options remain almost identical, the earlier creative effects position has now been swapped for a more sensible fourth custom bank. The previous function 1 button on the top right surface of the GH5 is now labelled I, toggling the main display to show everything to do with audio at a glance, including large level meters and various quality settings, all adjustable by touch if desired. It's a bit like a Q menu but for sound only. Meanwhile, bold red record buttons are located on the top surface and in the front right corner too. Turning to the rear of the camera, the AF mode collar is now around an AF area button with a new dedicated AF on button now alongside. The generous thumb wheel, finger and thumb dials remain as before and feel nicely tactile in use. Moving on to connectivity, the GH6 offers much the same ports as before, although the USB-C and HDMI ports have now switched positions. So, on the left hand side you get 3.5mm mic and headphone jacks, the former positioned nice and high to avoid obstructions. The USB-C port can be used for charging or powering the camera with a USB power delivery source, something the original GH5 actually lacked in 2017, and I successfully used both my MacBook 14-inch and Samsung Galaxy S20 chargers with the camera. Meanwhile, bonus points to Panasonic for sticking with a full-size HDMI port when many others annoyingly fit more vulnerable micro HDMI ports. You know who you are. Surprisingly, the GH6 won't offer raw video output over HDMI from day one, but it has already been promised for a future firmware update. In the meantime though, you do get internal 12-bit ProRes, more about which in just a moment. Also coming in future firmware is recording to an external SSD drive connected to the USB-C port, a feature so far mostly reserved for selected cinema cameras. Oh, and while the GH6 does of course have wireless connectivity, it strangely lacks the built-in live streaming capabilities of last year's GH5 Mark II. I quite like that, so I hope that it does get added in firmware. It's easy to miss, but the 2.5mm remote jack remains high on the grip side, while the sync port on the front of the camera can be used for timecode. You can also connect the optional DMW XLR1 interface and enjoy up to 4 channels of 48kHz 24-bit audio. Open the door on the grip side and you'll see the twin SD memory card slots of the GH5 have been swapped for a single SD slot and a new one for faster Type B CF Express cards. The SD slot can still exploit UHS 2 speeds, but the CF Express slot is required for the movie modes that require data rates above 800 megabits per second, and that's namely those 2 ProRes modes. For power, the GH6 inherits the DMW BLK22 battery from the Lumix S5, rated at 2200 mAh, so that's a nice boost over the BLF19 supplied with the GH5. Again, you can charge it internally with a USB power delivery source. Moving on to composition, the GH6 inherits the same viewfinder from the GH5, so you get a 3.68 million dot OLED panel with 0.76 times magnification. It still looks great, but 5 years later I'd have preferred to find at least a 5 million dot panel on a flagship body, a bit like Olympus has done on the OM1. That said, it would have increased the price, so as always it's about balancing the features and the upgrades. Interestingly, the screen is also a little smaller than the GH5, so down from 3.2 to 3 inches, but now with a slightly higher resolution of 1.84 million dots. But Panasonic has made the articulation much more flexible by inheriting the cunning approach of the Lumix S1H. At first glance, it looks the same as the GH5 with a side hinge allowing you to flip and twist as usual to pretty much any angle, including forwards to face you, or back on itself for protection. But the clever part is an additional hinge at the top which allows you to angle the screen vertically upwards in a quick single motion without obstructing any of the ports, and also remaining on the optical axis. You can also exploit this angle with the screen flipped out to the side if preferred, again keeping well clear of any of the ports. This mechanism may inevitably be chunkier to accommodate this double articulation, but for me Panasonic has really nailed it, and in terms of all-round flexibility here, it's become my favourite. And now finally onto the heart of the GH6, a brand new sensor with 25.2 megapixels and no low pass filter, delivering the single highest frame resolution in the Micro Four Thirds system to date. As always, Panasonic won't reveal who makes the sensor, but it is their own design and it is different from the 20 megapixel sensor found in the Olympus OM1. This means the GH6 enjoys a small resolution advantage over Olympus, although sticks with contrast-based autofocus versus phase detect on its rival. The OM1 sensor is also a stacked design, offering potentially quicker readout speeds, but I look forward to comparing their rolling shutters in practice. Now, when it comes to autofocus, it's important to put all your assumptions aside and compare actual results. Now, I'm going to do this in more detail in a follow-up video when I have access to final production samples of both of these new cameras, but for now I can say that the GH6 has impressive object detection. It's very quick in single AF modes and also quite capable of keeping a moving subject sharp across a burst of photos. For video though, it can be a bit of a mixed bag, sometimes surprisingly effective, while at other times less so. To whet your appetite, I've got a selection of video AF examples for you in just a moment, but first a quick look at the photo quality. The GH6's native resolution delivers images with 5776 by 4336 pixels in the usual 4:3 aspect ratio of Micro Four Thirds, giving it around a 10% boost in horizontal or vertical resolution over the GH5 and other 20 megapixel models. When comparing test charts, the GH6 could certainly out-resolve 20 megapixels, but the difference wasn't exactly huge. Certainly, I wouldn't buy the GH6 based on photo resolution alone. If you desire high resolution, both Panasonic and Olympus offer pixel shift composite modes, which can work very well for mostly or ideally completely static subjects, boosting the detail and reducing color artifacts. On the GH6, high-res mode captures and composites 8 images in camera with 2 quality options, LL or XL, which generate 50.5 or 100 megapixel images respectively. And it's now possible to deploy them handheld, although again, for the best results, do mount the camera on a tripod, point it at a static subject and keep dead still during that brief capture process. To put the high-res mode to the test, I photographed my standard test chart, first using the single frame 25 megapixel mode. Let's take a closer look before comparing the 50 megapixel high-res version, which is clearly out-resolving the single frame version and actually roughly matching my test shots that I took from the Sony Alpha 1 and the Canon EOS R5, although of course they are delivering this resolution with a single frame. And now for the 100 megapixel version, which under ideal conditions resolves even finer details. Now charts aren't particularly exciting, so here's my standard landscape view of Brighton Pier using the Leica DG 10-25mm lens, that's nice and sharp, first with a single 25 megapixel frame. And now let's compare it to the 50 megapixel composite version, which is resolving visibly greater real life detail. And finally for that 100 megapixel version, which is potentially even better still. Composite modes are getting more cunning, but can't help struggling with any subjects that are in motion, which does rule out most landscape shots thanks to birds, cars, people, and even foliage moving around in the breeze. But for product shots, archive, or even well-behaved architecture, it can work a treat. As I mentioned earlier, the GH6 strangely lacks the 4K and 6K photo modes that have long been standard on Lumix cameras, so sadly no more post-focusing or pre-burst shooting here. But there is still of course burst capabilities, with the GH6 now shooting up to 75 frames per second with single AF using the electronic shutter, or up to 7 frames per second with continuous AF. Switch to the mechanical shutter and it'll fire at up to 14 frames per second with single AF, or 8 with continuous. And I'll be testing the burst and continuous autofocus for stills in a follow-up video, but stick around for some video examples. Just before moving on though, a quick run through the sensitivity range for still photos using a night landscape view of London taken with the Leica DG 12-60mm lens. If you take a close look, I'd say the images look respectably clean up to 800 ISO, with a mild sprinkling of noise appearing at 1600 and 3200 ISO. By 6400 ISO, I'd say the finest details are beginning to look a little mushy, with 12800 even more so, and the top sensitivity of 25600 looking poor at high magnification. Okay, now onto video, with the GH6 offering a wealth of features and quality settings. Like the GH5, the available frame rates are based on 3 system frequencies, 24Hz for cinema, 50Hz for PAL, or 59.94 for NTSC. I'm going to show you some of the PAL menus because that's where I am, but we'll talk about the full ranges available. 1080 video is available from 24 to 240p, the latter allowing a 10 times slowdown on a 24p timeline. 4K is available from 24 to 120p, and in the choice of 16:9 or the wider DCI shapes. Meanwhile, the top video resolution of 5.7K can be recorded in 24 to 60p in the DCI shape only, where the frame measures 5728 by 3024 pixels. All video modes are recorded uncropped and with sound regardless of frame rate, even 1080 240p. Anamorphic modes are also available for use with special lenses, recording 4:3 shaped video in a cropped 4.4K format between 48 and 60p, or in an almost uncropped 5.8K format between 24 and 30p. The biggest one measures 5760 by 4320 pixels. Impressively, almost all video modes are available in 422 10-bit, including all 1080 and most 4K frame rates. The exceptions are 4K at 100 or 120p, 5.7K, or any of the anamorphic modes, which are still in 10-bit, albeit 420. And there's no restrictions on profiles, so you can enjoy 10-bit whether you're filming in standard colour, log, or anything else. Most video modes are also available in a choice of bitrate, using either H.264 or H.265 encoding. With so many different combinations and numbers, I'm just going to direct you to the Panasonic spec sheet. While the broadest range of resolutions, frames and bitrates are available in the MP4 and especially the MOV formats, the GH6 also offers the fairly unique option of 5.7K in the Apple ProRes format, recorded internally. ProRes is available at 24 to 30p in the choice of ProRes 422 at 1 to 1.3 gigabits per second, or ProRes 422 HQ at 1.5 to 1.9 gigabits per second. All of these demand the speed of CF Express memory cards on the GH6. While my recent 14-inch MacBook Pro is able to smoothly edit H.265 video, I've owned older models that really struggle with this high-efficiency codec. In contrast, ProRes with its mild compression is much easier to edit on more modest or older systems, and by recording it internally, the GH6 saves you from having to transcode it later, plus that final render will probably be faster too. It's also a robust codec with lots of potential for adjustments in post, which is some consolation for the absence of raw video while we wait for that firmware update. Speaking of grading, the GH6 includes full Vlog out the box, not that light version, and doesn't force you to pay to unlock it either. There's also a dynamic range enhancement option, which combines data from 2 different sensitivities to boost the tonal range to a claimed 13 stops when used with Vlog. It's kind of like exploiting the benefits of dual native ISO combined into one video up to 60p. If you prefer an easier life, there's also HLG in some modes, which delivers an HDR ready solution that looks great when played back on HDR displays, including the screens on those new 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. As a camera aimed at videographers, there's also loads of assistance options from viewing Vlog and HLG, de-squeezing anamorphic content, SMTP bars, waveform and vector scope monitors, both of which can be repositioned by dragging, as well as focus peaking while recording, and frame markers for just about every aspect ratio and safety areas that you can think of. Right, that's a lot of information to absorb, and if you missed any of it, it's all written down in my corresponding review at cameralabs.com, so head on over there if you need to see it all again. But now it's time for some results, starting with recording time and overheating tests. Now, the GH6 isn't the first model in the series to offer unlimited recording times, but it is the first to do so with the aid of a cooling fan. This ensures no overheating issues in any mode while keeping the body reasonably compact. There's 3 fan speeds, slow, normal and fast, with slow being barely audible and fast sounding a little like a modest PC. Here's how they sound in relation to each other. The fan menu allows you to manually select between the 3 speeds or go for one of 2 automatic options, with Auto 2 disabling the fan when it's not necessary. Note that the forced fan off option is only available in photo mode, and if you're filming 5.7K or frame rates above 100p, the normal speed becomes the minimum. There's also a maximum temperature cutoff setting, but I didn't need to increase it beyond the default standard setting in my own tests, but your mileage will of course vary. For my first overheating test, I set the GH6 off recording Cinema 4K at 25p with DR boost on battery power alone. The camera managed to record 1 hour, 23 minutes and 34 seconds before the battery expired, and no overheating issues. I then switched to a freshly charged battery and set the quality to Cinema 4K at 100p, where I managed 53 minutes and 20 seconds before the battery ran out. Again, no overheating issues. So how about at the highest bit rates? With the GH6 set to 5.7K ProRes HQ, I managed 42 minutes and 46 seconds on a fully charged battery, and again no overheating. So far it was the battery that was holding back my maximum recording times, so I switched to an external USB power delivery source, in this case my Apple MacBook Pro 14-inch charger. With the quality set to Cinema 4K at 25p with DR boost, I managed to record uninterrupted for 7 hours and 20 minutes spanning 3 files without any overheating. This time the limiting factor was my 512GB CF Express card. So for my test so far, the GH6 is clearly built to avoid overheating and is ready to record as and when you need it. It's a professional tool. But what about the video quality from this new Micro Four Thirds sensor? Here's my usual test scene of Brighton Pier, first filmed in 1080 25p using the GH6 and that Leica DG 10-25. 1080 footage is 16:9 shaped only, so it's pictured in my DCI project here with thin black bars down the left and right sides. Next switch that out for 4K 25p in the same 16:9 aspect ratio, followed by the slightly wider Cinema 4K in the 17:9 DCI shape. The lens focal length hasn't changed. And finally for the top resolution of 5.7K, again in the DCI shape. To really see the difference between them, let's zoom in for a closer look with 1080, then 4K, then 5.7K, each delivering progressively more detail, especially the jump between 1080 and 4K. Now, I do love sharing real-life tests like these, but to really see the differences in potential resolution, you can't beat a technical test chart. So let's take a closer look at 1080 video on the GH6 at 25p, then 4K at 25p, and then 5.7K at 25p. And now back to 1080, which in my test looked a lot like the Canon EOS R5 or R5C, with each being a fraction ahead of the Sony Alpha 1 at that same resolution. The GH6 also maintains its 1080 quality up to 100p, although at 200 and 240p there's a big reduction in detail. So while this high speed is nice to have and impressively remains uncropped and still recorded with sound, it does incur a big drop in quality. But how about a real life example to show you how it looks in practice? In terms of 4K, my GH6 resolution results look similar to the Sony Alpha 1, with both cameras looking much better than the Canon EOS R5 standard 4K mode, albeit a fraction behind the R5 when it's set to 4K HQ mode. But a key benefit of the GH6 is maintaining its 4K quality all the way up to 120p when some of its rivals fall behind as their frame rates increase. For example, while the Canon R5's 4K HQ mode may deliver some of the best looking 4K around, it's only available up to 30p and prone to overheating. Meanwhile, at 60p, the R5's 4K resolution falls back to the standard quality and falls noticeably further still at 120p. In contrast, the GH6 not only avoids the overheating issues of the original R5, but also its 30-minute clip length, and like the Sony models, it records audio on high frame rate video as well. In my test, the GH6's 4K 120 was also a tad better resolved than the Alpha 1. Here's how 4K 100p from the GH6 looks, slowed by 4 times on my 25p timeline. Of course, Canon's more recent video-oriented R5C resolves many issues with the original R5, but its 4K 120 still falls behind rivals, and the camera also downgrades some of the R5's video autofocus capabilities. As for 5.7K on the GH6, it may deliver a slight boost in detail over the 4K modes, but it was easily out-resolved by the 8K modes of the R5 and Alpha 1. That said, 8K on the R5 and Alpha 1 is only available up to 30p versus up to 60p for 5.7K on the GH6, so as always there's pros and cons to weigh up. Moving on to dynamic range, I found the 10-bit vlog files had plenty of potential for subtle tonal retrieval at either the highlight or shadow ends. They also edited smoothly on my 14-inch MacBook Pro. Meanwhile, the 5.7K ProRes files played nicely on much older systems and rendered faster on any of them too. Alright, now it's time to talk focus, and as I mentioned earlier, Panasonic has stuck with its contrast-based DFD autofocus system for the GH6 with its latest object detection software. You can see it in action here, where I filmed the GH6's screen to show the object recognition tracking me and switching to face and eye detection at pretty respectable distances. Now here's the actual video file filmed with the GH6 and Leica 10-25 at 25mm 1.7, where you can see the camera doing a fair job at acquiring me and keeping me in focus as I walk towards the camera, and especially if I pause for a moment. Object detection only works up to 60p though, and as you can see in this next clip filmed at 4K 100p, the GH6 struggles to find me as well as it did previously. Here's the actual video file you saw the camera filming a moment ago. You wouldn't say you'd rely on it. Now, one solution for better autofocus at 100p or faster is to use a single AF area, which is what I've done here. Now the GH6 is doing a fair job at refocusing on me while filming 4K 100p. And now for the video file that I showed you recording earlier, showing the technique in action, although of course losing me if I move away from that fixed AF area that I previously chose. I also found this generally only worked for subjects moving at a fairly modest speed, so if you want a camera that can stay focused on fast sports or wildlife during the high frame rate video modes, the Canon R5 and Sony Alpha 1 remain your best choices. How about autofocusing between near and far objects as the cameras move from side to side? In this example, the GH6 does a pretty good job most of the time, better than you might assume given the absence of phase detect autofocus. A tougher test is to see whether the AF system can settle on a subject without fluttering back and forth. A really tough test for AF stickiness is having some bokeh balls in the background, as these can flutter in size and that really gives the game away. This has always been an Achilles heel for Panasonic's AF system, and while the GH6 is arguably its best so far, there's still a little bit of pulsing visible at times which can be off-putting in certain compositions. At this point, the opinions always become polarised. If your subject is mostly still, or you're able to manually pull focus, then who cares about video autofocus? If, however, you're a one-man operation, like me, then reliable autofocus during video is not just useful, but pretty much essential. I not only rely on it when presenting pieces to camera for all of my videos, but also when filming sporting events or wildlife when I know that a camera is taking care of the focusing, leaving me to follow the action. I've filmed fast-moving events like sea swimming races in 4K 120 with the R5 and Alpha 1 fitted with long lenses that would have been very difficult to keep in focus with the GH6. Likewise for filming birds flying straight towards me. But then the Alpha 1 is considerably more expensive, and when I filmed a sea swim race in 4K 120 with a Canon R5, it overheated shortly before the end of the race, forcing me to drop the quality to 1080p to continue recording. It's also important to note that while the GH6 may not have the best movie autofocus around, it may already be good enough for your application. Here's one of my vlog tests showing not just how well the GH6 kept me in focus, but also how well the built-in stabilization works for video. Is this good enough for you? In fact, let's see that stabilization in action for static subjects, here in the normal IBIS only mode, keeping the composition pretty steady. Meanwhile, the various enhanced stabilization modes applying varying degrees of digital compensation to further lock that image in place. How about rolling shutter? The GH6 may not have a stacked sensor, but as you can see, it handles skewing artifacts better than many other cameras, including the EOS R5. Here it is in 4K for comparison. But what about high ISO footage, I hear you say? Okay then, here's a selection of clips I filmed around London at night, mostly at around 6400 ISO, and while there is some noise visible, I don't think it actually looks that bad. Of course, this is all down to personal preferences and expectations, but on the whole, I was very impressed by the out-of-camera video quality from the GH6 under most conditions, especially the 4K and the 5.7K modes, which were both packed with detail without ever looking over sharp. Okay, now for my verdict so far. There's loads of great cameras available at the $2,000 to $2,500 mark, especially if your main focus is stills photography. Sony's A7 Mark IV, Canon's EOS R6, the Olympus OM1 and Panasonic's own Lumix S5 to name but 4 should all demand your attention. But if you're after a camera more focused towards video, especially high frame rate 4K with all of the extras, the Lumix GH6 becomes one of the most compelling models around. How many other cameras even offer 4K 120, let alone for $2,200? How many maintain their quality at higher frame rates and can keep recording without overheating? How many offer the kind of shooting assistance typically reserved for dedicated cinema cameras, like waveform monitors? How many support internal ProRes recording or the chance to record direct to external SSDs, albeit in a future update? Speaking of which, Panasonic has announced a firmware roadmap for the GH6 promising not just USB SSD recording and 4K 120p RAW over HDMI, but also ProRes options in 4K and 1080. You could argue that the GH6 really should have launched with these, especially RAW over HDMI, but at least we know what's coming. Ultimately, the same core arguments for and against the GH6 and its rivals remain as before. Models like the Canon R5 or R5C and Sony a7S III or Alpha 1 also offer 4K 120, but with much bigger full-frame sensors, more confident phase detect autofocus, while both R5s and the A1 also support 8K. But they're also all comfortably more expensive than the GH6 while lacking many of its Pro Assist tools. They have less effective stabilization, may reduce in quality at high frame rates, and have varying immunity to overheating. It's also interesting to remember that Sony still doesn't offer any wider DCI shaped video, and Canon has bizarrely adopted micro HDMI for many of its models, including the R5 and R5C. There's pros and cons to all of them, and as always, it's a case of carefully weighing up which features are most important to you, and which of those downsides you can overlook or find some way to work around. Either way, the Lumix GH6 is a highly compelling camera for videographers that deserves serious consideration, and along with the Olympus OM1 proves that Micro Four Thirds remains relevant and highly desirable. Right, that's it for my first looks review. I hope you found it useful. I plan on covering anything that I've missed or was unable to test in a future video, so do let me know if there's anything that you'd like to see. And if you're interested in the Olympus OM1, I've got a video all about that too. Thanks for watching, and check out the description and my web review for more details. See you later. Bye bye.